Okay, hello everyone. Um, Thank you, Nina. I'm Jo Sharp, Professor of Geography here at the University of St Andrews and Scotland's Geographer Royal. And I'm delighted to welcome you to this discussion as part of the Wardlaw Museum's Rewrite the Future exhibition. And this is running all the way through the summer in conjunction with the university's new Centre for Critical Sustainabilities. And we're here to discuss the role of imagination in making societies better. And we're starting off with a book, this book, that I co-edited with this woman back in 2020. This is Val McDermid. Val doesn't really need an introduction, but she's an author and broadcaster and best known as an award-winning crime writer who was, until recently, most often referred to as the Queen of Crime, until the Agatha Christie estate issued a cease and desist because they trademarked it. And so she now goes by the much more appropriate, much more Scottish Queen of Crime. And we're going to work our way through the history of this book and some of the ideas and along our panel here of distinguished guests that are going to help with this discussion.
And it was inspired in 2019, partly because of what was going on at the Edinburgh Book Fest, but also partly because a bunch of us were talking how we would like things to be different, how we would have liked to see our country develop post-referendum had it gone the other way, how we would like to see the world go post-Brexit, which none of us was very happy about in Scotland. So we had a growing feeling that we're losing the ability to have reasoned and respectful dialogue. Everything seemed to have become polarised. We said in the introduction to the book, like so many of you, we have succumbed too often to rage and despair in recent times. We've seen battle lines drawn where once we negotiated, vitriol and hatred dispensed where once we'd have listened and debated, fake news, deep fakes and barefaced lies where once we could believe. Too much of our political debate has shrunk to a nuance-free 280 characters. And it's no surprise that we find ourselves pushed into polarised positions when we try to engage in that way. It seemed to me at the time that the devil didn't just have the best tunes, they had the best stories. And populist leaders have been emerging over those recent years that seem to be able to alter the narrative of people's fears, shaping them into twisted tales of good and evil. We all know the names. and threats and risks, good and bad, have been marginalised, it seems to me, offering simplistic answers to complex issues. In 2019, the Edinburgh International Book Festival motto was, "We need new stories." And we felt that at the time, and that's what provoked us into editing this book. And I think for me, it was typified by Ali Smith's session at the book festival. I think Ali is probably the finest novelist writing in English in the UK at the moment. And she gave a wonderful talk, and she talked about how I'm going to talk really fast. There's going to be lots of ideas here, but don't be frightened if you miss something. Just think of it as waves coming in on the shore, and if you miss one, there'll be another one along in a minute. And Ali, to me, typified that sense of hope, that sense of possibility. And if you've read her Seasons quartet, you'll know what I mean. She writes about a world that is sometimes dystopian, but somehow throughout this, she threads hope. And that's what we wanted to do with this book. We wanted to thread hope through the conversation, to remind people that it was possible to imagine a different future.
Yeah, and it seems that we're often told that imagination is a bit childish or a bit of a luxury. You know, in these times of austerity and cuts, it's simply too much of a drain on expenses to support imagination, creativity, and so forth. You know, we've had these kind of arguments that we need to sacrifice libraries, we need to sacrifice the arts to keep the lights on in hospitals, and there's this kind of hierarchy that's presented that, as I say, somehow the imagination, creativity is somehow a bit trivial. But it seemed to us, I mean, following from a whole range of amazing thinkers and activists, but it seemed that if you can't even imagine a different future, however fanciful it might seem, how on earth do you start to create the politics that start to take us towards that future? If you can't imagine it differently, well, we're just going to be stuck with the same. And I think there's a lot of the populist voices, as you mentioned, Val, that would quite like us to think that what we have now is inevitable, that there is no alternative, that we shouldn't imagine anything else. So we thought, having spoken to a couple of people about this idea, and they didn't laugh at us. We spoke to Ali, and she said she would give us a chapter for it. We spoke to some other people, and there was a degree of enthusiasm. So we thought, okay, let's see if we can get people to use their imaginations, to think big. So we contacted people from across the country, some of the folks that you see here. We contacted writers, academics, activists, cooks, musicians, comedians, well-kent faces, and those who were perhaps not quite so well known. Everyone apart from politicians, because we felt they probably had enough of a voice already. And in fact, we kind of hoped that this book might, to a certain extent, hold their feet to the fire. And we did make sure that every member of the Scottish Parliament got a copy of this. And it was very interesting who replied and said thank you and who didn't. So we set our contributors a tall order. We asked them, and we were so terrified we were going to send all these messages out and no one was going to say yes. So we sent them out into the ether, and in fact we were in New Zealand at the time, so we felt even more remote. And we said, imagine a country that you would like to live in. We gave contributors between 500 and 800 words, and we also gave them a month to do it in. We decided to use the argument about urgency, about these being important discussions, but also hoping that, well, we know what it's like to be asked to do things. Yeah. And if there's too long a lead-in time, you say yes, and then things disappear over the horizon. So we thought, let's keep the urgency. And we hoped that although these were short contributions, that they would stimulate conversations, people would pop in, see, have a flick through the list of contributors, see a name they knew or liked, read that, and then just go on to the next one, which it's just the alphabetically next entry, but it could be quite a different imagination, quite a different perspective than one that had been offered. So we really wanted to try and get back to that respectful discussion and to the complexity of life that Val was saying we really felt that we'd lost. Not everyone we invited felt able to contribute, but we're full of admiration for those who did take up the gauntlet and pretty much did all come in more or less on time, which was astonishing. We academics have a lot to learn from this, I think. Some have chosen to address the really big challenges we face, to think afresh and with huge ambition, imagining what it might be like if we were starting a society from ground zero, if you like, whereas others have chosen to focus on very small, very specific things. And we'll maybe talk about a few of those examples later. But importantly, we didn't imagine our book as a manifesto. We didn't want there to be a singular voice, and indeed there's not a singular voice. We wanted the experience of reading through the contributions to be more akin to walking down the street or perhaps sitting in a cafe or a pub and listening to debates, listening to conversations, listening to different people who were arguing different things, proposing different things, a kind of cacophony, a kind of multiplicity, because democracy and inclusion like that is not about everyone agreeing, but it's about having the space that all those different views can be heard.
In fact, as the replies started to come in, we were out there in New Zealand, as I say, in our little apartment, and every evening we'd check what had come in from abroad, and it provoked really vigorous discussion between us about the contributions. Some of them we agreed with, some of them we disagreed with each other sometimes, and then it also sent us off in lots of different tangents. So we felt quite hopeful that the finished product might provoke a similar response in readers. We received nearly 100 contributions, and the book was produced very quickly. Jo did the spreadsheet. I don't do spreadsheets. And then it came out. It was scheduled for the first week in lockdown, which we didn't know, obviously, when we were preparing it. We had planned for a big launch at the I Write Book Festival in Glasgow, which obviously couldn't take place because we were in lockdown. And so we feared we might have missed the impact. We did a Zoom event, and it was one of the first big sort of book events done on Zoom. And we thought nobody would tune in because we weren't familiar with the concept. But people did tune in, and people downloaded it afterwards and watched it. So it turned out to have been the perfect format in a way for COVID times. People contacted us afterwards to tell us how much they had valued the book. That some people were reading it one piece at a time, one a day, and that was something that was giving them hope in dark days. On occasion, I'd be in the supermarket, and even though I was masked up and 2 meters distance, people would say, "We're really liking your book." And so it did seem that it was finding a home, even though it was not quite in the way we had anticipated. We wanted to take it out into the world, and it went out kind of under its own steam and the steam of the internet. And I think for a lot of people, it made them feel part of a wider community. People who were locked down on their own, isolated from family and friends. Reading the book, I think they found ideas there that resonated with them, that made them feel less alone.
And so we're delighted that we've got a couple of the original contributors with us today. In case you're wondering what these other people on the stage were going to be doing. So on my far right, we have Lyndsey Croal. And Lyndsey was included in the original edition of Imagine a Country as one of the young geographers. Since then, Lyndsey's writing career has flourished. She's been published in over 80 magazines and anthologies, including Apex, Analog, Weird Tales, and Myslexia's Best Women's Short Fiction. She's a Scottish Book Trust New Writers Awardee. She has had a Shirley Jackson Award and a British Fantasy Award finalist, and former Hawthornden Fellow.
Hawthornden. I can't help it, I'm a pedant. Sorry.
Her longer works include, you should have done this introduction. Her longer works included Have You Decided on Your Question, Limelight and Other Stories, The Girl with Barnacles for Eyes, Scream Volume 5, and 2 days ago, or was it a few weeks ago, her most recent book, Dark Crescent. So, Lyndsey, I understand that you wrote your piece collectively, but could you read what the young geographers submitted in 2020?
Sure. Yeah, so this was a piece written with Cameron Mackay and Ailey Watson. We were kind of the fellow young geographers, and we were editing the Young Geographer magazine at the time. So I'll read it. No one is too small to make a difference. This is the key message from the burgeoning youth climate movement that first began in 2018 and has since swept across the world. Nobody would have guessed that a teenager from Sweden could be the catalyst for a global political movement that intends to hold the polluting neoliberal system accountable for the damage it has caused for generations. A system left unchecked and unanswered for decades. Whilst Greta Thunberg is just one voice amongst many climate activists from across the world, together these voices are united. We would like to imagine that this is just the beginning for Scotland and for the world. As part of a contingent of young geographers with the Royal Scottish Geographical Society, we had the pleasure and privilege to travel to Sweden to present Greta with the Geddes Environmental Medal in the summer of 2019. We travelled across land and sea, brought together with other environmental activists by our shared goal of addressing the climate emergency and our passion for telling stories. Over the course of the journey, we discovered the diversity of our ideologies, faiths, identities, but that together the diversity made our approach stronger. Similarly, the process of writing this piece collaboratively is exactly that sort of collaboration we imagine and hope a future Scotland would adopt. We want to be part of a country that takes into account every voice and is therefore able to make a greater impact than the sum of its parts. When we met Greta, Scotland had been hailed as a world leader in climate change action, even before passing the climate legislation it adopted later in 2019. However, the measure of leadership is changing, and so Greta's message to Scotland was clear. Every country must act and every government must do more. Many argue that as a small country, Scotland's emissions are insignificant in comparison to other nations, but we believe that climate change is everyone's responsibility, and it is irresponsible to accept no blame for a problem to which we as a nation have contributed. Currently, the impacts of climate change are disproportionately borne by poorer countries and communities, and often the people most vulnerable are those who have contributed least to the human causes of climate change. This injustice is just one of the many reasons to make a change. Today, there are glimmers of what a positive future could look like in Scotland, from community energy and a flourishing renewables sector, from shared allotment spaces for local food production, to circular resource and tool sharing networks. We have the knowledge we need to move forward. Scotland has the potential to continue on this path, to invest in a better future and to become an example of what sustainability that works for everyone looks like. It is not too much to imagine a future where inclusive, welcoming and sustainable communities lie at the heart of our culture. So we imagine a country that has embraced this shared message from Greta Thunberg, global activists and our own homegrown Scottish climate campaigners. We imagine a future of Scotland that prioritises climate justice, a Scotland that is not afraid to stand up for those that are voiceless. We imagine Scotland leading the world by example, empowered by an inclusive, innovative and sustainable society, whilst at the forefront of challenging some of the biggest problems facing the world today. We imagine Scotland's land delivering benefits for nature, biodiversity, climate and society, a Scotland with clean and affordable energy and infrastructure system that is just and provides benefits for all. In that future, we will listen for solutions not only from politicians or businesses, but from the younger generations, minority groups, and others who have been traditionally separated from decision-making. The way we structure our economy will be tied to a global green agenda, and Scotland will continue to be at the forefront of forging that path internationally. Just as no one person is too small to make a difference, no single country is too small to make an impact and bring forward change.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I love that last line. I think yours was the only collaboratively written piece. Was it a challenge to agree on something? Did you come to that topic quite quickly?
Yeah, well, because we've been working on a kind of collaborative issue around the Arctic and climate change, we were already working in that space and we're already interested in sustainability. I was working in climate change advocacy. Ailey was doing her PhD in climate and gender justice, and Cameron was a filmmaker doing like sustainability initiatives. So that was something we initially thought of. We wanted to talk about. So yeah.
So that was kind of the obvious topic
Yeah,
to
that bring
come
us
to.
together. Yeah.
And you said in your piece that the process of writing was almost like the model that you saw as what you'd like for the country.
That kind of collaborative way of thinking about things and thinking what were the key points we wanted to get across and how do we bring those together. And I think that's something that I would like to see a future Scotland that kind of takes everyone's every diverse communities, everyone's voice it matters and makes a difference, and it's not just kind of a small portion of society making those decisions on people's behalf. And I think that's actually, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I think, heading towards that sort of, you talked about that polarization of views and how we're not listening enough to that kind of that collaborative voice. Yeah.
In case you wonder what that point was referring to, I've said to everyone, can you please hold off saying what you would do differently until we get to the next bit of our conversation, because I know that the inevitable senses, but now but we will come back to that. So thank you very much. And I think it's really lovely hearing people read their pieces as well. I mean, I meant to say this earlier when we had our we did an online event at the Edinburgh International Book Festival in 2020 around this, and we had our contributors each reading their piece, and it completely changed the way that I heard some of the messages. And in fact, there was one that I suddenly realized I got so lost in listening to Jo Clifford talking about her contribution that I'd completely forgotten that I was supposed to be listening attentively and coming up with a question. I was just sort of sitting, just marveling at the performance. So I think it's lovely hearing them in the voices of those that have contributed.
Yeah, because I think one of the things that came through very strongly when people's contributions started arriving was how heartfelt they were and surprising in many cases. But we'll come on to that later again. But you contributed to the original edition also, Rebekah. Rebekah Widdowfield was the Chief Executive of the Royal Society of Edinburgh at the time, Scotland's National Academy. Since then, she's moved institution and is now here at St Andrews, where she is Vice Principal, responsible for people and diversity, responsible for the delivery of the university's equality, diversity and inclusion activities. Rebekah is a member of the board of the James Hutton Institute, and a former board member of the City of Glasgow College, the Scottish Book Trust and the Centre for Homelessness Impact, as well as being an honorary fellow of the Royal Scottish Geographical Society. So, going to share with us what you wrote back then?
I will do, yes. So imagine a country which taps into the talents of all its people. In 2012, the Royal Society of Edinburgh published a report on women in science entitled Tapping All Our Talents. They'd found that female science graduates were much less likely than male graduates to pursue a career in science. But that wasn't all. When they did go into science roles, women were underrepresented in the top positions in academia, in government, and in business. The title was a great way of drawing attention to the loss of talent that represents. But tapping all our talents is, of course, much broader than ensuring that women are not lost to science. It's about making sure we harness the potential of all our nation. And just imagine a Scotland with that level of collective capability. Imagine what we could achieve. Imagine the impact it would have on our communities. Imagine what it would do for our mental well-being if everyone was enabled to fulfil their potential. Living in a country which harnesses the talents of all its people is an easy thing to agree with. Who doesn't want to see people find their wings and fly, to develop and flourish doing something they are good at? But what does that mean in practice? It means living in a country that fully nurtures all our children. It means giving kids access to books, music, drama, all those things that help nurture creativity and support mental well-being. It means not putting kids into boxes at an early age as being academic or non-academic, good or bad. It means recognising that the circumstances in which children grow up has a huge impact, and ensuring that our policies and institutions address, not replicate or reinforce social inequalities. To take one example, the Commission on Widening Access spent some time looking at the level of attainment required to be successful at university and concluded, focusing purely on grades in isolation from the context in which they are achieved means that universities are often failing to recruit the best talent. And if universities are sometimes missing out on that talent, isn't there a risk that the nation is too? And it's absolutely not about everyone going to university, although everyone should have the opportunity to do so. Harnessing the talents and potential of all our nation means ensuring opportunities to learn in different ways and to learn throughout life. It means second chances, and yes, maybe third and fourth ones too. And it means recognising and valuing different skills and talents. My gran left school at 14. Her reading and writing were not the greatest, but as a seamstress, she was phenomenal. I'm sorry to say her granddaughter did not inherit any of her talent in that regard. But one of my favourite things is a beautiful tablecloth created by my gran and nana, her mum. My gran doing the embroidery, my nana the crocheting. So yes, we need the skills and knowledge that come from higher level study, but we also need the skilled practitioners too, who bring such colour and pleasure to our lives. We know the value of diversity in the workplace and the benefits it brings in terms of performance, innovation and well-being. Yet how much more this matters in a country. Tapping all the talents of the population, imagine such a country.
Thank you. Given the wide range of your interests and involvements, why was it that you wrote this particular piece?
I think it was born out of a number of things around, I guess, my upbringing, some of the early research I'd done around homelessness and social exclusion, and actually roles in government that I'd had, where I guess a frustration that as a society we often implicitly and explicitly through our structures, behaviours and rhetoric that we other people, and then alongside that the lack of appreciation that the very different lives that people are born into and the opportunities that affords for some and the opportunities it denies for others. And it was actually really positive to actually think, well, it doesn't have to be that way. Rather than thinking about people as a burden, as a problem to be solved, actually thinking much more through that lens of this is an asset to be harnessed. And I don't mean that in an exploitative way, but actually something that enables people to fulfill their potential, which is good for them and good for the wider society as well.
And it seems that in a way, your move to St Andrews in this particular role has even placed even more focus on this part of your dream, your imagination, your beliefs.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, obviously, I didn't know at the time I wrote this that I would be coming here, and I certainly am not an EDI practitioner, but I think it's that, I guess, inclusivity that has been, I guess, a bit of a thread throughout my career, and that I think is really important. And some of it picks up on what Lyndsey was saying as well. It's about everybody has something to contribute, and actually recognising that I think is fundamentally important for the welfare of society as well as with individuals.
And it seems now that increasingly the whole idea of EDI is under threat. The notion that diversity and inequality and getting rid of inequity is not important. I mean, we see what's happening across the pond in America, and inevitably there are people over here who will see that as something that's appealing here. How do we combat that?
So,
Whatever, you're getting way ahead of our schedule.
Sorry.
I mean, it's a big question, but I think the how I think is a challenge, but I think the must is absolutely there, and that we shouldn't lose sight of actually all that we have achieved as a society. And yes, there's always the potential to go backwards, but it doesn't have to be. And I think we all have a responsibility of that. I think it comes to, again, to what Lyndsey was saying, is that there are certain things we should expect and be demanding of our governments, but there's also things we should expect and be demanding of ourselves as individuals and as communities.
Thank you. Sorry, I've dragged you into the future there.
No, I think it's really interesting because some of the contributions that appeared simplest or almost a little bit flippant, I think really got at what you were saying there. So the late great Jenny Godley drew a cartoon of every week kids should get soup made by a grandmother. And initially you kind of think, oh, well, that's a bit, yeah. But then it's like, no, this is all about, you recognize what different generations have for each other. And there's quite a lot of intergenerational contributions that say, we've got to recognize the value, as you were saying, of young people in decision making, and others were saying, but also there's older folks who've got a lot to contribute.
And the metaphor of nourishment.
Yes,
it's more than just a plate of soup. The nourishment you get from your elders, if you like, your granny and your grandparents, and the old person who lives next door to you.
Yeah,
is a way of learning about the world outside your window.
Yeah. So I think some of the simplest contributions ended up being the ones that, well, we certainly had a lot of discussion about. As time passed, after this book was published, we realized that, if anything, the messages that our contributors are made and the kind of overall ambitions of the book were becoming more significant rather than less significant. And so we went back to the publishers and said, how about a second edition? Available from all good bookshops. And we produced this paperback version, and we invited a few additional contributors. And we had a relaunch again at the Edinburgh International Book Festival in 2022. And alongside this, we wanted to ensure that we got younger voices in as well. So we ran, with the Royal Scottish Geographical Society Education Committee, we ran a competition for school children to write their entries, which was fantastic. We got about 120 submissions, and we invited two to come and share their entries with us at the book festival, which was fantastic, and some really imaginative alternative we got from that. But fascinatingly, as a bit of an aside, we did S1 to 3 and S4 to 6. The 1 to 3s were really great, really imaginative. The 4 to 6s, not so much. And I really worry that our education system, certainly our geographical education system, is maybe battering some of the imagination out of the kids. So we're having a big curriculum review at the moment. So if you have an opportunity to lobby anyone or to speak to anyone involved in education, please do talk about the importance of imagination.
My absolute favourite of the entries was the winning one, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yes. One of the contributors, she had imagined scientists developing a bacterium that ate dog poo. So there would be no plastic bags hanging from trees as you go for a walk, and there'd be no messes on the pavement because this bacterium would be eating the dog poo.
Yes, so it would be made into bags.
Yes.
That you could put the poo in and tie it up, but then it would just dissolve and become part of the soil.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I thought that was a brilliant idea, and it would improve the quality of life.
It would
for everybody.
Indeed.
I think. Sorry. Small things. So one of the contributors to the second edition was Peter Mackay, Dr. Peter Mackay is a senior lecturer in literature in the School of English, which sometimes seems to me to be perhaps not the right place for you to be here at the university. Originally from the Isle of Lewis, he's an expert in Scottish and Irish literature from 1800 onwards, and especially in Scottish Gaelic literature. His award-winning publications include the books The Strange Loneliness, Heaney's Wordsworth, and Solly MacLean. An AHRC BBC Next Generation thinker, he's a frequent broadcaster on Radio 3 and BBC Radio Nangale. In 2024, he was appointed the Scottish Macker. Perhaps even more importantly, Peter is captain of the Scottish Writers' football team. Peter, would you like to read your piece for us?
Happily. I have always felt buoyed by the sight of lights across water. Looking across from Slate to Malig, say, with house lights studding the dark bulk of the mainland and streaking and smearing across Kyles. There's a sense of community at a distance there, a reassurance. Growing up on the west coast of Lewis, as I did, there was no such permanence. Though there would be, looking out onto the ocean, the passing dots of ships taking the main sea road, the largest lit up and spread out like a floating township. Our own villages, meanwhile, would be austere strings of Christmas lights draping the coastline, not too near the edge for fear of dropping off. There is vertigo to so much darkness, to the heaving mass of an invisible ocean, to those millions of stars refusing to stand still overhead. What does it mean to imagine a country? Is it the same as imagining a community, or imagining what it means to belong deeply, frivolously, superficially, skeptically, transitorily, however, in or to a place? Maybe too big a question. What then of this country? Any country, any Scotland, I imagined, would have to incorporate the Western Isles, where I grew up, and Edinburgh, where I now live. And the emotional, let alone physical, connections between them seem tenuous. Those lights twinkle dimly. For Gaelic speakers like myself, Edinburgh has often felt, despite an ongoing attempt to develop a Gaelic centre and a dedicated Gaelic secondary school in the city, like a distant irrelevance. For centuries, if Edinburgh existed in the Gaelic imaginary, it was largely through the threat of Calton Prison, the risk of having your wallet tricked from you on the high street, or of meeting your end at the hands of the common executioner. Uneasiness still comes for me from having a military garrison at the centre of a capital city. But the problem, if there is a problem, is not just Edinburgh. For most of my childhood, any town or city, Stornoway, Portree, Inverness, Glasgow, felt like an unreality, a not entirely welcome necessity, a historic mistake. One of the great things about the Highlands as a space is the lack of a definite centre, of a clear hierarchy. Who, again, is the clan chief, and do we need them? And though in my childhood there was a castle looming over Stornoway, by then it was no longer the mock baronial 19th century drug haze dream, but a somewhat run-down college, shabby and apologetic for its past. Even if in its current incarnation as museum and luxury hotel, this too has brought its own problems. I can't imagine, in other words, the contemporary Highlands, or by extension Scotland, through the traditional British image of the oak tree, one continuous organism in which we are all sheltered by the canopy of fill in the blank of your own centrifugal or hierarchical fantasy, whether it is London, Edinburgh, Inverness, an aristocracy, old wealth, or whatever. Indeed, for me, the Highlands are, for the better, a forest, or some kind of rhizomatic entity, with many different growths appearing dotted around the place, in a way that is erratic or unruly, or indeed creative. This may be just another fantasy version of a country, one in which the eccentric, the small, the marginalized can find its own place, can be its own center. But it is the country I would imagine, one which has rejected the open market, the inevitably wealthy white male visionary who would happily buy the land and bend it to their will and shape the idea of community as they see fit. It's a country in which those glinting lights of community exist all year round, where caps aren't doffed, where fuel poverty is not endemic in some of the most renewable energy-rich parts, where there's a universal basic income so that everyone has the chance to take little or big risks and not live in constant fear of poverty, where Gaelic speakers, especially in the Highlands and Islands, have affordable housing, jobs, the possibility of making a full life there, where clean and affordable travel between all parts of the country is possible to imagine, where every village, each community has a cracking festival celebrating the oddest, weirdest, most localized thing they can imagine, and which they hold for themselves first and foremost, and after that, all tourists are welcome. The Festival of Bog Cotton? The Lewis Kabaddi Festival? Aye, sign me up.
Thanks, Peter. Why did you choose to go down this particular route with your piece?
Because I was resisting the question. I think it was the first paragraph going, it's got nothing to do with imagining a country. It's trying to work my way into it. I'm really interested in the idea of a country or a community as embodied argument, or a Stushi, or a Rami, or all of these voices coming together. But I think that's viewed quite positively in Scottish terms as well. And I think I'm really interested in the idea of being resistant to the idea of a country, or the idea of a country itself as a form of resistance to something else. And that pushing back against different things.
We've been quite good over the centuries of having that difference within Scotland. What Hugh McDermid calls the Caledonian anti-syzygy, the yoking together of two opposing forces, and sometimes more than two. I mean, we are a country of three languages: English, Scots, and Gaelic. And
Don't forget the Doric.
Don't forget the Doric. Okay, 4 languages. A number of the other contributions have focused on this idea of language. It's what role do you think language plays in the building of communities?
I think it's really important that in the last couple of weeks we have had official status for English, Gaelic, and Scots in Scotland. I think we're all bilingual to some extent in Scotland, because we do all have some knowledge of Scots, some knowledge of English as well, and then Gaelic there. I think we should celebrate as many different languages as possible. The anti-syzygy is fine, because what it does is say no country is unitary and single, and that's what we should hope for. It is at least binary. But I think we really have to go beyond that, because I think we should celebrate all of the languages that are spoken here as Scottish historically, so Latin, French, Gaelic, Irish, Welsh, and all of the contemporary languages as well, because this is how we actually have more fun. Because speaking between languages is fun. You learn things.
I can. Ken, I'm fine. I'm for 5, Ken.
And I think it's one of the healthiest things we can do is constantly learn from different sources and acknowledge that we are multiple in and of ourselves.
And I like to think that we can find a way to be inclusive and not use language as an excluding factor, not to tell people you can't speak like that here, or just to use language as a way of keeping people out of the conversation.
Hi, and so at the end of that piece, one of the things I'd forgotten is Gaelic doesn't have bog cotton as bog cotton. It's one of the most commonly used images for anything that is white, because it is so beautiful. But I grew up knowing this and also watching Kabaddi on Channel 4 on Sunday mornings. And so having this wonderful sense of a sport that I had never seen played in the flesh, and why can't we bring that in as well? And having different inspirations from all over the world, whether they are in terms of language, cooking, sport, anything, and making that part of who we are too, without appropriating it in a fully respectful way.
So we thought we would take advantage of being here in St Andrews to invite another voice into a conversation. Dr. Harry Watkins has been sitting here very patiently, waiting his turn. He's the director of the St Andrews Botanic Gardens, and we're going to be plugging the Wardlaw Museum exhibition a lot today. But another place you should visit whilst you're here, if you're visiting St Andrews, is the Botanic Gardens, because they're fabulous. Harry is a lecturer, an honorary lecturer in the School of Biology here, and also a senior lecturer at University College London. Now, he's not one of the contributors to the book, but when I read that one of the Botanic Gardens' ambitions is to be a place of hope, I thought you really were the perfect person to invite to join us for this discussion. Harry has been director of the Botanic Gardens since 2020, and his research interests are using ecological forecasting techniques to improve decision-making in urban ecosystems. And he has bold ambitions for the Botanic Gardens. And I'm going to quote you from an interview. He said, "What we're doing in St Andrews is a fundamental redesign. And the driver for this overhaul is climate change. We're proposing a very different answer to the question, what is a botanic garden for?" Which I think is intriguing. But Harry, I'm going to put you on the spot. You've not had the chance to have a whole month to think about your contribution like the others. But if we were going to do a third edition of this book, what would your imagination be? What would you want to see in the country of the future?
I think the answer would be a biological one. I think
Thought it might.
It would be our relationship with the rest of biology, I think, is what I would want to write about. And when I think about what that entails, it entails something very different to how we, at the moment, largely connect with the rest of biology. With some colleagues, we're working on a book at the moment called Designs for a Biocene. And this is taking the idea of what might come next into the world of like the design and really making sure that whatever we could envisage, we have the tools to actually make happen. So it's rooted in this idea of hope and agency, which feels very often remote and hard to hold on to in the situation we find ourselves in at the moment. So our idea about what the relationship with the rest of biology looks like is rooted in this idea of the way that the human mind has evolved over tens of thousands of years. And it's rooted in this idea that as energy systems have changed, going from the use of fire into agricultural systems, broadening out into different expanded networks, we've seen huge leaps in human consciousness. And those things coming together in leaps of using different energy resources, certainly differently, expanding on networks, making leaps from like an ideological consciousness into a psychoanalytical consciousness in the 19th century, say, or going from a mythological consciousness into a religious consciousness. These are all tied up with big, profound movements. And we are thinking now, as we stand in the world of AI and large language models and distributed energy networks, what does the future of the relationship with the rest of biology look like? Because with each of those leaps, we're seeing this massive growth in like an entropic debt, basically. We're seeing all of this displacement being born by people who aren't using that energy. And so when I think about what would I imagine the country to look like, or what would I imagine a future to look like, it would be working with materials that are made to live. Really working with biology to build our houses, streets, the systems we're part of. The idea that you are living in a house that is literally alive, to me, is an incredibly exciting idea, but it feels reachable. In the exhibit that we've got at the moment in the Wardlaw Museum, we've got a panel, which is a material which is alive, and it has the same compressive strength as a brick. It has many of the same performance standards. We haven't set fire to it yet to know what the fire regs need to say about it. But it weathers in St Andrews, because we've been having that side. But it's using, instead of cement and carbon-intensive materials to bind the aggregates, it's using filamentous bacteria. And so this thing is alive, it's actively sequestering carbon instead of releasing it during its lifespan. And it's got this aesthetic, which is completely different to concrete and brick. And light moves through it.
What does it look like?
It's flicking. So at the moment, you go and sit in the garden, it's kind of crumbling in parts because kids are doing this to it. So we need to work on that. What coming in?
Sorry, I'm just trying to imagine what it looks like.
It looks like it's made from silica, and depending on where the light is coming from, it can look beige or cream or aggregatey. When the light comes through it, you can see the bacteria in it. It glows brown or ochre or gold or turquoise or blue. It's unreal.
This sounds like science fiction. This sounds amazing. I think we should just all stop now and go straight across the road and go and see this.
Come and see it. Come and see it in the garden. But it's when I think about imagining a country, what I would be wanting to talk about, I would want to be connecting how we live with the rest of biology to the history that we have as a species, and the idea that how we think is shaped by the world that we see around us on a daily basis. And when we hear the panel talking about hope, fun, I want to see that reflected in the ways that we live and the buildings that we're living in. The ideas of joy and hope and love feel very difficult sometimes in the present climate, but it's in reach, and unless we can really build it and feel that these tools are there, we don't stand a chance. So I want to think about what this needs to look like.
And I think that's so important, because so often the tales of climate futures. I mean, I started off with this quote saying that you were kind of responding to climate change, and it sounds like this is quite a direct response to this, quite apocalyptic sort of narrative we often hear. And one of the things that we're trying to do through the the Centre for Critical Sustainabilities is to think about how we talk about sustainable futures in a way that doesn't just feel doom laden and therefore make people feel hopeless. But the fact that you're responding with something that sounds beautiful. I mean, it's not a kind of hair-shirted, this is what you can't have to have a sustainable future. This is, here's something beautiful you can have for a better future.
Absolutely. One of the early lessons I think we learned in 2020 in the Botanic Garden was that you can pretty much optimize any landscape organization for any outcome that you want. The question is kind of what are the trade-offs, and are you ready to accept the implications of those trade-offs? And so as I look at where we stand now in 2025, what do we want to make happen? Knowing that there is a tangible, doable, reachable, positive future is absolutely critical. And unless you can speak it and show it, it feels remote.
Yeah.
You know, so bringing that into the garden, even in these kind of like prototypes that we're doing at the moment, any opportunity we have to try something out, and okay, that it might look differently beautiful, that's pretty good.
Yeah.
You know, I'm up for that.
And it sounds a little bit like, as Peter was saying, that his vision was perhaps more community rather than nation. Is this a kind of set of local imaginings, a set of local environments? I'm trying, because you started off, I was expecting you to be talking quite locally about environments, and then you started off with the history of humankind and biology, and I was thinking, gosh, this is a much bigger story than I was expecting. But do you see the kind of connections from all these little localities?
Completely. There's no doubt, as you look at the world that we're now living in, that you have the tools to communicate and connect across bigger distances than ever. So whatever your understanding of community is, it's going to have long tails. How we transcend those scales of space is interesting, but certainly it starts where you are right now.
One of the things I'm doing at the moment is I'm one of the judges for the Royal Society's Book Prize, which is about scientific books that can be read by a non-scientist and understood. And one of the things that seems to me to be the case is that scientists used to be in silos. Physicists didn't talk to biologists didn't talk to chemists, but there seems to be much more breaking down of those boundaries within the world of science, where people are coming together to understand that different scientific approaches actually have connectivity and can contribute to the other disciplines.
Absolutely. And one of the questions is, why is that, I think? And when you look at certainly like the funding landscape at the moment for scientists, almost every funding call that is out there now requires interdisciplinary thinking and for teams to come together. So that's really encouraging. I look around at a lot of stuff that win the awards, you know, by counter to it, and I kind of think, you know, you haven't really resolved this idea of interdisciplinarity, so there's a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
And certainly a lot of the applications that I see submitted get feedback saying, oh, that sounds tremendous, that sounds wonderful, but you haven't really shown how people are really connecting and moving across intellectual disciplines. But certainly the future is increasingly connected and interdisciplinary.
Yeah, I mean, at the start of anything, there's always big gaps.
Yeah.
And then you close the gaps as you move forward. People learn how to work together across different fields.
Well, it's back to language again. It's back to the fact that we're using different languages, and it's the fun of trying to work out whether we all mean the same thing when we talk about landscape or we talk about whatever.
The course that I teach on at UCL is a postgraduate course, and it's in the School of Architecture, but we bring undergraduates who are architects, come from that design background. We bring in undergraduates from biology, biochemical engineering, and it's amazing once you see those barriers broken down. What these students come up with isn't nuts. It's brilliant. Like they've completely no boundaries at all. And they imagine totally different things to what we can think of.
And that's great.
I was just say if I may come in on something, but one of the projects I got involved in a couple of years ago, run by Denise Baden from Oxford University, I think, and she matched up authors with scientists to write fictional stories that had to be scientific, and it was just, I got matched up to write about blue carbon and seagrass and kelp forests in Scotland, but it had to be like peer reviewed by a scientist, which was my first like experience of that, because I write a lot of science fiction and I don't have a scientific background, so mostly having to do research. But one of the nice things, it gives you that freedom to be like imaginative as a fiction writer, but then have it checked for the science. And the stories, the book's called No More Fairy Tales, Stories to Save Our Planet. So they're all very optimistic, like visions of like climate futures. So it's like similar kind of interdisciplinary there. It was really interesting way.
Yeah. I did a similar thing some years ago with the Wellcome Trust. And every year they bring together writers of drama, radio producers and scientists, and they choose a different theme each year. And the year I was doing it was, the theme was antimicrobial resistance. And I listened to the scientists, listened to the chief medical officer for England at the time, Sally Davis, saying the plague is coming and was going to see us off. It's not an if, it's a when. And I took away from this the apocalypse, you know. So I went away and I wrote a trilogy of radio plays called Resistance about an apocalyptic plague. We transformed it ultimately into a graphic novel, which came out just around the time of COVID.
I thought you stopped publication because
We did.
your ending wasn't quite as hopeful as we were hoping for in terms of COVID, and it wasn't really the time to be publishing that.
No, it was there was times for hope and future possibilities, and this wasn't the book that fitted that category really. But it's great to work with people out with your own experience and out with your own understanding of the world, because you see things through a different lens, and it creatively is inspiring, and people take something away from it that they wouldn't just get from my normal run of fiction.
Exactly. Yeah.
Don't have to kill everybody. Well, you do have to kill them in a different way.
But Lyndsey, if we can come back to you, I mean, hearing Harry talk about the different relationships in biology between people and other species, I think that having had a look at some of the chapters in your most recent book, you know, there is a sense of a kind of vital nature in those. Is that the kind of thing that you'd be writing about now if we were to say, okay, give us a contribution that's from Lyndsey Croal and not from the young geographers?
Yeah, I think climate would still be very like intrinsically there. Over the last like 5-6 years, I've been working on like a range of climate, energy policy, nature, land use, and things like that. I think one of the things that come up with both Peter and Harry was the kind of community angle of like going back to your roots and thinking about the community. I think we've lost some of that in the kind of world that we live in with social media and all that kind of things. And I think that came up in a lot of the chapters in the book as well. And in Scotland, one of the specific things I think I've been kind of more deeply thinking about over the last few years is like land ownership and land use and the very deep inequalities that exist there in Scotland. And, you know, there's very much, I think, well due for like better regulation or rules on how land is owned, and how community land ownership could really like revitalize some of that, both like natural world, allowing community ownership of energy. And you were saying around the kind of the ridiculousness of some of the communities up in particularly like Shetland and other islands having that rich renewable and other energy history, but having the highest levels of fuel poverty. And if there was that potential for things like community energy, that would be something I'd want to kind of draw out a little bit more, and that more connection to nature and things like that, which I thought a lot more about during COVID, and that kind of isolation, not being able to go out into nature as well. And yeah, I write sci-fi and horror, so it's not always the most helpful all the time, and a bit of fantasy, but I do try and bring in that kind of idea of, if you kind of go back to thinking about nature, that kind of idea of folklore and landscapes, you can learn a lot through your engagement with it and your engagement with the community as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I could rant for a long time about
You do.
renewables. I do not understand why we don't have a sovereign wealth fund for renewable energy, but I will hold this. I will plant my rant because there's people in this audience who've heard it before.
Well, it's extraordinary though that we don't have a sovereign wealth fund. I mean, Norway has all sorts of social good that has come from their sovereign wealth fund, and you know, I go back to the campaigns of the 1970s. There was a great campaign in the 70s with a caricature of Margaret Thatcher with oil dripping from her fangs. It's Scotland's oil, and you know, there was some truth in that. We're still producing energy in Scotland that goes to power Canary Wharf.
Yes.
From an area of the country that has some of the highest fuel prices anywhere. But that's another story. Don't get me. Yeah, I'll park my rants if you park yours. So, if we could go back to you, Rebecca, what would you write about now?
I'd probably write on a similar theme, maybe in slightly different way. I mean, you've already mentioned about the sort of the rowing back around EDI across in various countries. We were just saying before we came on about I take hope actually from the Budapest Pride March yesterday, which was banned and actually had the highest turnout that it's had. So there were ways of fighting back. But I mean, we haven't solved some of the things I guess I was hoping that we might imagine as a future in terms of, the attainment gap is still increasing. A young person in the most deprived part of Scotland is 5 times more likely than somebody in the least deprived to be not in employment, education or training. We incarcerate a higher proportion of people than almost any other European country. So there's all ways in which we don't harness the potential of people. Now, I know there's some complex political issues here. I'm not being naive. But I think maybe what I'd maybe focus on more is actually language, is actually the rhetoric around this, because I think the rhetoric leads to so much else in the representation. Well, I had a British Academy doctoral fellowship many years ago now, but it was entitled Beggars, Blaggers and Bums, Media Representations of Homelessness. And it sounds a bit sort of flippant, but it was about actually how we talk about people, how we represent people has a real life impact and consequence for actually how we treat people, how we perceive them, how we value them or don't value them. So I'd probably write something that was still very much in the sort of, can we value and appreciate and for, support the nurturing, to use your word, Val, and potential of everybody, but maybe focusing on that rhetoric, particularly at a time when, if you look at the rhetoric around immigration and some other issues, actually it doesn't take us to a better place. And I think it is easy sometimes to feel powerless in terms of our ability to maybe influence government. But if we think more about rhetoric and language, again, we all have a responsibility there. We all have agency and can do something.
Yeah.
And would it be angrier?
I would be, but having worked in the civil service for 16 years, I'd obviously keep a cap on that, and nobody would see that I was angry.
See, I'm lucky I can express my anger and my rage. I'm certainly angrier than I was when we first did this book.
Yeah, but I think anger as a mechanism for action, rather than a mechanism for lack of hope.
Yeah.
Right.
What about you, Peter? What would you write about if you were doing it again now?
I'm angrier. I'm certainly angrier. And I think there are more things that I value that are threatened. So hearing a BBC journalist asking the head of the Students' Union of Scotland why we have universities, why universities exist. Can you make the case? Because businesses can do that now. And AI and large language models will take over with how we teach people. You won't need a lecturer. And all of these things, many of the core fabrics that I grew up taking for granted as good and progressive things that will continue are now at risk. And so I'd have been angrier about that. I'd probably been a bit more ambitious about language because I hadn't realised that I might be one of the only Gaelic speakers in it, so I might have pushed that a bit further and said, why can't we imagine this as a multilingual country where everything can take place in 2 or 3 different languages? Why do we have to limit ourselves in that way? It's also, my piece is a COVID piece. So partly I was just imagining what it was like on the Isle of Lewis that I couldn't visit. And so I might not be quite as nostalgic for that distance or thinking in those terms. But what we were doing at that time was trying to imagine community in non-physical ways as well, to imagine community that does work digitally as well as through proximity. And I think that's a positive. And I think trying to continue that way of keeping us flexible in how we communicate with each other, hello everybody out there, as well as in physical spaces, I think is something we do have to maintain. But we have to have better stories still. You started in 2019, but we need to be very careful because political discourse has become solidified and has gone places I did not imagine it would in the last 5 years. The use of language is harder, crueler, more damaging to many, many people. And I think we do have to be very active in being celebratory and careful with language. I'm doing something really nice tomorrow. There's a school up in Banff who are coming up with a glossary of Doric words for the landscape. And they've got this nice wee, every pupil has signed up that they will use as many of these words as they could. And it's partly just because if you know how to talk about the natural world with as much precision as possible, you know the names of things, you care for them a lot more. And you also care about your own language and where it came from and the roots. And so these kind of very small scale initiatives build up to entirely changing how the houses we live in actually can grow and have different biological forms in them as well, because you know and understand what's around you and you're not scared of it.
Yeah, I mean, people talk about code switching a lot, between the way that you speak, depending on where you are and who you're talking to. I think we need to maintain the importance of having several codes, each having several codes, so that we don't all just become homogenized. When I went off to Oxford, nobody understood what I was saying. Ken, what I mean? Every time I opened my mouth, folk just looked at me. And I had to learn to speak English. And now what I have, what you describe it as my Radio 4 Scottish accent. But whenever I go back to Fife, I just fall back into the vernacular, Ken. So it's important that we maintain these historic differences, but that we also cleave to our own backgrounds, our own histories, and don't let them go.
And you do that a little bit in your writing as well, because each of your, particularly the Karen Perry books, you always have a smattering of good Fife words, which infuriates your well, I was just going to say your American editor, but your English editor as well.
You have to contextualize them, and then they can guess.
But I think it's really important that those are still there.
Those words are
So if you were writing a chapter now, if we were going to do a new edition now, what would you do?
Well, I think when we were putting this together in the first instance, a lot of people said what we were talking about was a pipe dream. It's ridiculous. It could never happen. Particularly politicians the few politicians who did actually pick it up and look at it and say, well, that could never happen. Of course, you just have to put that to one side. It's
all very nice.
Impossible. It's all very lovely, but it couldn't ever happen. And then COVID happened, and suddenly we found ways of dealing with things. We found the homeless were taken off the streets and housed, something that we were told was impossible. This couldn't be done. It was economically impossible. It was socially impossible, and yet it was done. And when COVID was over, instead of maintaining that step forward, just let it go again. And one of the other things that happened in the process of that, in the late teens, we were starting to talk about UBI, Universal Basic Income, looking at what was happening in Finland. And again, we were told this is economically impossible, it won't work, blah, 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 blah. And then in the last Scottish parliamentary elections, every party, apart from the Tories, said we should consider the possibility of a universal basic income. So it's quite clear that a lot of the things that we were told were impossible, were just a pipe dream, or fantasy, are within the bounds of possibility if we can only find the political will to do it. And so what I would write now is to say to politicians, we are going to hold your feet to the fire until you do these things, until you make happen the things that we know are possible. Don't just keep palming us off. Don't keep spending money on more bloody missiles. Spend money on the things that matter, which is your people. And so I think that's what I'd write now. Simple, straightforward.
You're supposed to ask me what I would write.
Well, what would you write, Jo?
Seamless. This is just seamless, isn't it? This is going to sound like a complete academic's answer, but for me, that book is kind of my ambition. It's the idea of having debate. Of being able to have robust discussions. I mean, it's that very kind of modernist notion of the public, that's where you encounter difference, that you meet views that are different from your own, experiences that are different from your own, voices that are different from your own. You can hear the argument. You don't necessarily come away from that encounter in agreement, because I said I don't think democracy is about everyone agreeing, but there's that you would gain understanding of the other perspective, and they would gain understanding of yours, and so you'd go away with a better understanding of each other, and somehow being able to have the respect for that diversity of voices, that range of difference, without it becoming a set of binaries, becoming a shouting match. I mean, we when we were thinking about this in 2019, we thought back to the early days of the IndyRef debates in Scotland in 2014. Now, I realise everyone had different experiences of this. We started off swithering, to use a good Scottish word. We weren't at all sure which way we wanted to go. Historically, ethnic nationalism was not something that we found kind of having had a positive history about defining. I used to cringe about Scottishness because it was basically anything but England sort of identities or tweeness. But what seemed to be happening all around us was that people were talking about what kind of society we wanted Scotland to be. My students, I was still teaching at Glasgow University at the time, and I've been trying to get my students to engage with politics for years. Suddenly, everyone was talking about politics. And my experience of that time was that it was a very civic nationalism. It wasn't about who we were not. It wasn't about a blood nationalism. It was about what kind of community do we want to be? Who do we want to, how do we want to treat the most vulnerable in society? What are the values that we want to promote? How do we want to be seen within the world? So it was that kind of, it was a kind of quite a local place-based thing, but also then Scotland, not in terms of Empire 2.0, which we were seeing being projected from Westminster, but Scotland is a kind of small moral country that would work, it would have to work in partnership with others. And, both of us sort of came round quite strongly to that point of view, because it seemed that's very much the vision of the country that we wanted to live in. And but at the same time, we had friends, really good friends, who were on the other side. And at that point, we were able to have heated debates with them and still remain friends, even though we disagreed on this one issue. And it seems that the role of social media in has kind of destroyed this public. So, as I say, the book kind of embodies the kind of respectful but challenging discussions that I really would like to see at the heart of society. And the next question is, well, how do you get there? And I think there's so many contributions in the book that I just love and go back to many times. But Chris Brookmeyer, the crime writer, really surprised me, because if you know his crime writing, it's quite visceral, outrageous. And I was thinking, God, sweary, what on earth is he going to come up with? And he came up with the idea that philosophy should be taught to primary school kids, which was quite a surprise. But it was a brilliant idea, that you don't just teach kids kind of knowledge, but also what knowledge means, what it means to have an argument, what it means to disagree with someone, some of these bigger concepts. And that's exactly what we should be doing. Our education system should be provoking these thoughts a great deal more than it does at the moment. Was there any contributions that surprised others here, or that you really kind of were inspired by or took away? And then we're going to come to questions from you, by the way. So get thinking.
Can I ask you a question instead of that? Partly because I was really interested by what you're saying, and I lived in Ireland for 10 years. And so my understanding of Scotland is often partly through an Irish lens as well. And I'm a civic nationalist like you. But I'd be terrified if there was a referendum again in 10 years' time and it was a yes. I would still probably vote yes, because of the Irish example between 1916 and 1922. So there was this great opportunity in 2014, all of these discussions about what a country could be, that's really fluid. I think if it limped over the line in 10 years' time, having there been this 10 years of loggerheadedness, we might end up just with a variation of what we have now with the flags changed. And I'm worried about that.
I think you're absolutely right. And one of the things that, one of the things we've had some quite heated debates about is that when a couple of years ago there seemed the possibility we might have a second referendum, Val was saying, as long as we get 0.1% over, I'm happy. I didn't want to be in that situation for exactly the reason that you said. And I think part of the reason for that is because of the nature of debate, because it's become so binarized that you cannot shout at the other side to say you're wrong. And there's a lot of this around some of the what's been called the trans debate, the kind of lobbying insults from one side to the other. That's not going to change anything. It has to be about that kind of discussion where people understand each other. When we next have our vote, I want it to be 60-something%. It needs to be up there It needs to be a majority of people that are compelled by the vision, because if not, I think you're absolutely right. We end up where we were before. So, yeah, unfortunately, I kind of share your.
I think it kind of depends on the stories you can tell, in a way. Like, it feels very strongly at the moment that people on the far right have got better stories, or they're telling them more convincingly. One of the stories they told after Brexit was that the victory was significant and complete, and it wasn't at all. It was a very fine vote. You look at the moment, the arms manufacturing industry told a fantastic story. Arms spending is going to go up to 5% very soon. That's a huge victory for them. The people who would have voted historically for the British National Party voted for the UKIP, and now they're called the Reform Party. That's a better story than the BNP.
Yeah.
I think there's a huge amount. If you're going to win a vote on a small margin, you can do it if you've got a good story.
Okay.
Maybe kind of slightly disagree. Just, I guess, I think the way that stories are told, it's not so much, it's that we're in a political and like media climate where the media like creates this propaganda of stories, and they give equal weight to like outrageous stories versus sensible ones. And I think that's one of my big worries for the future, is the way that the media kind of creates a circus around certain issues and kind of creates these divides where there aren't like that much divides, and you would speak to someone face to face about these issues and you wouldn't have the same discussions that you see happening on the news or you see happening in magazines and things.
Yeah.
I don't, it's not a full disagreement. I just think like the stories are very much exemplified, like exaggerated often by.
And the media now seems to me to be, it decides what side of the fence it's going to sit on an issue, and then everybody who's not on that side of the fence is othered.
Exactly.
They're dismissed.
Exactly.
They're written off as being stupid or evil or misguided at the best. And the vitriol and the hostility that comes out of the media. I mean, I don't know if any of you have ever been the victims of the Daily Mail, but speaking as someone who has been, it's quite remarkable the vitriol that gets poured on your head. And there's no sense of balance anymore.
No,
there isn't a single, apart from the National, there isn't a single media outlet in Scotland that supports an independent Scotland, for example. And, you know, so there isn't a measured debate in the public sphere. There's plenty of measured debate and conversation among friends and meetings like this, but in the public sphere, it doesn't exist anymore. And that's troubling.
When you take the traditional forms of media, amplifying certain stories, and you put that then in the context of the social medias that we have, which amplify vanity, narcissism, fear, anger, that's a toxic combination.
And also echoing what we believe anyway. I mean, that's my problem. If I believe my social media, we wouldn't have had Brexit and we'd be independent. And everyone would believe exactly the same thing as I do in terms of gender and all, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And that we don't have that public that I want anymore, where I will encounter things that are different because the social media goes, oh, you like this, therefore you'll like this, and you'll like this, and you'll like this, and you don't even need to listen to that. We've actually got someone in the audience who wants to join in. Can we, are you okay to just shout? Oh, no, wait for microphone, sorry.
We've got a roving mic.
Sorry, we'll come back to, do you
Ross.
want to say something?
Well, it was about, so I think there's real value in hearing a diversity of voices, but even in the sort of quality, sort of, let's say Radio 4, should take that as quality, is the way that often debate is pitched is against one person against the other, and it's very much pitched in a way to have an argument. And actually, until very recently, say on climate change, also this belief that objectivity meant you had to have somebody who didn't, you know, regardless of what the science was. So I think, you know, it isn't just that, unfortunately, it isn't just the mirror, it's actually the way we sometimes construct argument as a society to make it an antagonism rather than actually a debate and a discussion that comes to some views.
Thank you so much for a very fascinating panel. I was also thinking about things about rising momentum. We have people who are striving to come ahead above other people. We're exploiting the planet. And I think like the panel, there were like common threads that were weaving through the stories. We were talking about creativity, sharing voices. We were talking about including other people or valuing other people. We were talking about linguistic diversity, we were talking about including more than human perspectives in how we engage in our system. So what do we need in order to change drive, right-wing momentum? We need a good narrative and a good way of talking about how we change things, and that came up in the last intervention. And I was thinking, why not use these different perspectives to create a new narrative on the political left, or maybe find something new that's not left, but that shares like listening, diversity, and all these ideas that were woven through this panel to find a new future and mobilize people, and not only one group of people, but whole societies. And yeah, I think it was a really brilliant debate. And why not start a movement and get going and exciting people?
We'll follow you, Val.
I'm busy this week.
I mean, I mean, that's the impossible question in a way. There are all these ideas, and I mean, I think sometimes to make this academic just for a moment, if you'll excuse me. I mean, I think sometimes in academia, we have a tendency to have these really big narratives that, you know, it's all about, you know, if you think about the radical traditions, you have to have complete systemic change. You've got very heroic narratives of sort of Marxist or socialist triumph. And if you don't have this complete, if you don't follow this complete narrative, then, well, you know, you've failed. And yet you have other thinkers who talk about minor theory or feminist theory or post-colonial theories or all sorts of different approaches that say, not only is, you know, is it possible to have alternatives, but alternatives are already happening, and there's all over the place. And we've heard examples here of where communities are doing things. In the book we had someone representing the community on Egg, where they have taken ownership of the land and are having a greater control over their community. The young folk engaging with Greta Thunberg and stuff. So things are changing, but it is the challenge in a kind of public space that has become increasingly commodified, controlled by so few voices, so few powers now that are sort of shaping it, is how to ensure that the good stories that are there are getting heard. And it's I think it's on all of us to make sure that we don't just share the tales of doom and gloom and despair, but start to talk about the things that are working well. It may not be good clickbait, but we can start talking about that. And just as a final wee aside, in the geography program here, some of our students came to us and said, God, geography is so depressing. You're always talking about, you know, everything being doom and gloom. And so we've just introduced a new course in first year, the geographies of crisis and hope. And we decided that politically it's important that we do talk about some of these often quite small, but nevertheless important changes that people really are making in their lives. And as you say, if you can't see it, you can't be it. So let's start all talking about it and engage.
And one of the important things that can be done is popular culture. One of the problems is that a lot of popular culture embodies these ideas that we all find so difficult and so toxic. And certainly in my books, I try to embed ideas that are a bit different from that. And these are the ways that I think one of the ways that we can move forward with this is try to embed in popular culture, in film and television, in gaming, in novels, try to embed more hopeful stories or an alternative approach, characters who have a different set of values from the ones that we dislike or are uncomfortable with. And that is one way of doing it. But, you know, you have to work on this as not just being a single voice in the wilderness, to encourage other people to do the same, to encourage creators to get on board with that.
Could I come right back to Jo's first point in some ways and to respond to that? Because I think the things that I value, truth, justice, care for other people, equality, diversity, inclusivity, are used as weapons against the left because they're held at different standards. And if you don't actually care about these things, then you can get away with so much more. And so there's a huge attack on core values that I think are still important and worth fighting for. But I was really interested in your comment about how first to third year pupils and then fourth to sixth year pupils have different types of imagination and different confidence and fear. And I think That's the social media moment coming in. That's the moment of having all of these different doubts, anxieties coming into them. And when I've been in schools, you see a marked difference between first year and fourth year pupils in terms of their freedom, their confidence, their willingness to say things. And then there's an awful lot of anxiety. So all become secondary school teachers, or primary school teachers. And because the kids are always all right. The kids always, if you give them the chance, the opportunity, the means to express themselves and the talent, the future will be fine. But something I think is going wrong. There's so many difficulties at the moment for
It's
them.
also because at the moment, sorry, this is my bug. Another of my bugbears is that teaching is taught to the exams, and the Scottish Qualifications Authority has far too much control over what is taught, and so there's no space. I've spoken to school teachers. There's no space in 4 to 6 to have time to imagine. 1 to 3, there's a bit more flexibility, and teachers can be trusted with to do something that they know that the kids will be good at. So so that's a structural change that we can all make a difference on, I think.
Yeah.
There was a question down at the front, and then sorry, did you want to say something?
I was just going to say that I think for probably all of us up here, we can all point to somebody who was an inspirational teacher when we were at school, who gave us the confidence to be ourselves and to write the things we wanted to write, to say the things we wanted to say. And if kids don't have that space, then they never develop that confidence in their own ideas.
Yes, so please go off and be school teachers.
Just the word that Val used a time ago. And John Lennon was quite hopeful. Would you mind if I read some of the words that John Lennon said on this? Imagine no possessions, I wonder if you can. No need for greed or hunger, brotherhood or pain. Imagine all the world, people sharing all the. Imagine all the people sharing all the world. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us and the world will live as one. John Lennon. Pretty hopeful.
Well, that sounds like quite a good place. Wow, Nina, are you going to be pessimistic? Because we're okay. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, that didn't end well. But there you go.
No, I'm going to pick up on Jo's point about reading out loud and trying to link it to Peter's point about multiple languages for a question, which I'll then give a bit of context for. So the question for the panel is, how important do you think it is for imagining a future for Scotland to have more and more prominent soundscapes that are intercultural and also interspecies? And my context for this is that last weekend, when it was lovely and sunny, I went with my friend Katie, who some of us know here, to the West Coast, and we camped just south of Kilmartin. And Katie isn't a Welsh speaker, but in Wales they get taught the Welsh language, and we saw all these Gaelic names, and they're beautiful. And at the same time, I'm reading Ian Bradley's Coffin Roads book, which also has all of the place names have their Gaelic names. And I don't have a clue how to pronounce them at all. Now, if you're reading something, it often tells you, interprets, as Val does in her books, what it means. But I really found that I couldn't own those words because I couldn't speak them. And also, I wouldn't be able to recognise hearing them spoken with the written word. And then Katie said that she Googled, and she said in Wales, 26% of the population now say that they can more or less hear and understand if they can't speak, whereas in Scotland for Gaelic, it was about 3%. I don't know if that's correct. She Googled, I was driving. So that's my question really, is how important do you think it is for imagining a different small island Scotland? Because I would say island thinking, Jo, to pick up on some other conversations we had, is how important is it that there's soundscapes around us that are intercultural and also interspecies? Because the written word is one thing, and as Jo said, when you hear something, it sounds differently, and I think you can belong more.
Definitely. I think it's a very odd. I can only imagine how odd it is for most people in Scotland travelling the Highlands and not knowing how to pronounce the names of things. I'm lucky that I can. But yeah, Gaelic's a really phonetic language. It's really easy to pick up once you know the rules, but it's not taught. And so there's this dislocating feeling, I think, for many people in Scotland from the place names around you and your year and how you belong. I think we can easily fix that just by doing some classes in primary schools, not teaching everybody Gaelic, but just saying, by the way, this is how it sounds. And it might actually have helped that we have a Gaelic channel, BBC Alapa, but this means it's all siloed on TV. And so where there used to be Gaelic kids TV programs that everybody in the country would watch back when there were 3 channels, now you have to go looking for it. And so in some ways, the linguistic mixing has got worse.
What's very useful is listening to the football commentary on BBC Alba. If you support a lower division team, quite often the games are televised with Gaelic commentary. So I now know that the word for captain in Gaelic is skipper.
Yeah. That's my brother. He's one of the main commentators.
So did you want to come in?
Well, it's building on what you said, but also picking up on the idea of primary school children being taught philosophy. If I had a wish, it would be that primary school children was taught statistics.
Oh, God.
And the idea that you are taught from a very young age, that'd be amazing. Yeah. The idea that you're taught from a very young age about the world of possibility, and the idea that there are many different and sometimes difficult ways of understanding an idea or expressing it, seems consistent with the idea of having many different words for the same thing, understood in different ways from different heritages. I think that'd be wonderful, the idea of like learning much more about possibility and probability as a consequence.
We need to do a third edition. We need to get that through. Yes. I think we could continue talking for a very long time, but you've been an incredibly patient, well-behaved audience, way better than any of my classes when I've been teaching in here. I'd just like to thank our panel for being in here. And before we finish up, Val's going to have the final word. Just to encourage all of you to come over to the Wardlaw Museum after this, if you have time, walk through the lovely sunshine, and then come and have a look at some of these exhibits. Have a little poke at your bricks, and understand the beauty of this living architecture, and see some of the other fabulous exhibits that are there. And I think there's going to be some refreshments put on there too. There's a few copies of Imagine a Country. If you don't yet have your copy and you'd like to have one, we will be there to sign them too. And I'll hand over to Val for the last words.
We wanted to leave you with some concluding words of one of the original contributions, which seems so much more urgent than it did back in 2020. It's from Joe Clifford, who, and apologies to the other panelists, has the best biography. A proud father and grandmother, playwright, poet and performer, she's the author of 100 plays. I know by myself I cannot make this country happen, and yet I still think, yes, I will imagine this country and try to live in it as if it was already here.
Thanks, everyone. So we'll see you all at the Wardlaw. There's signs. You said there were signs, Ross. And then once you've finished in there, what time's the botanics?
5 o'clock.
5 o'clock. Yep, so you've got time to go to the botanics as well. I'll take that.